Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for the presentation of the William L. Brown Award. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Wise Jackson. I'm president of the Missouri Botanical Garden, of which the William L. Brown Center is a part. I'm delighted to be able to join you virtually for the presentation of this prestigious award that recognizes the outstanding contributions of an individual in the field of genetic resource conservation and use. The award is made possible through a generous endowment from the Sehgal Family Foundation in cooperation with the family of Dr. William Brown. Dr. Brown was a distinguished, internationally recognized scientist, businessman, and humanitarian. And over the course of 5 decades, he devoted himself to the collection, preservation, understanding, and sharing of plant genetic resources in order to help meet the global demand for food. The William L. Brown Center carries on this legacy in its dedication to the study of useful plants, understanding the relationships between human beings, plants, and their environment, and the conservation of plant species, and the preservation of traditional knowledge for the benefit of future generations. The William L. Brown Award recognizes an individual whose efforts and achievements reflect a concern for those issues that were so important to Dr. Brown. The awardees over the last 2 decades have come from diverse institutions and fields. They include conservationists, plant explorers, crop breeders, ethnobotanists, and policymakers. They share an inspiring vision of a world in which plant genetic resources are understood and protected for the common good. And each exemplifies a history of impactful work in bringing this vision into existence. As the 9th recipient of the William L. Brown Award, Dr. Gary Paul Nabhan follows this eminent tradition. He is an agricultural ecologist, an ethnobotanist, and an author. His work has focused primarily on the interaction of biodiversity and cultural diversity in the arid, binational Southwest, a landscape that has been his home for the past 5 decades. However, his scholarship, leadership, and inspiration have had national and global impacts. He co-founded Native Seeds Search in 1983 to preserve plant-based Southwestern agricultural plants and the knowledge of their uses. He served as Director of Conservation, Research and Collections at both the Desert Botanical Garden and the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. And Dr. Nabhan was the founding director of the Center for Sustainable Environments at Northern Arizona University. He now serves as the Kellogg Endowed Chair in Southwestern Borderlands Food and Water Security at the University of Arizona. Dr. Nabhan is considered a pioneer in the local food movement and the heirloom seed saving movement. His work has informed the conservation of the linked genetic and cultural heritage of his home region. His books include Gathering the Desert, Enduring Seeds, The Forgotten Pollinators, and Renewing America's Food Traditions, to name just a few, and they have inspired generations. Dr. Nabhan's past awards speak of the breadth of his impact and include the Calvin Sperling Award from the Crop Science Society of America, the John Burroughs Medal for Distinguished Natural History Writing, the Saveur magazine's Best 100 Food Initiatives, and a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. In 2018, Dr. Nabhan was named Distinguished Economic Botanist by the Society for Economic Botany, 36 years after William L. Brown received the same award. It is certainly fitting that he is now being recognized with this award named in Dr. Brown's honor. please join me in congratulating Dr. Nabhan on this honorable achievement. Thank you.
Today, I have with me Emily Warshevsky, Gary Nabhan, who is a pioneer in ethnobotany, and we're going to be chatting with him a little about his work and what he sees for the future of the field.
And I'm so grateful to be here with you, so thank you.
Yes, it's great to have you here. So let's start out with a question about you and Bill Brown, who both spent decades working in this field of seed conservation. Did you guys ever interact? Did you know him or work with him at all?
We did. I didn't directly interact with him, but because he was involved in the first survey of North American mazes growing tribe to tribe in about 1948, when I began to see what was left of Native American mazes in the U.S. and northern Mexico. I called him up and asked for guidance, and he continued to give me guidance when he retired from his executive positions. He really began to investigate deeply how some of the North Carolina corns came into the United States through a different route. And so we loved talking about that. And then I also had contact with Alice both before and after Bill died, and I admire and love her as much as I did Bill. So it's a great family and a great legacy that you have here at the garden, thanks to the Brown family.
That's really interesting. You have been working and thinking specifically about arid plants for over 40 years and thinking about the ecosystems and the ethnobiology. How did you first get interested in this particular area?
Well, that's a curious question that I've been thinking over the last couple days when I went back to where I was born in the Indiana Dunes. And I think it was a combination of being fascinated by what temperate plants could actually colonize moving dunes. And of course, there are prickly pear there and a lot of other genera that are shared with desert areas. Of course, they are fully temperate plants here. But I also grew up in a Lebanese American family. My grandparents and uncles were immigrants. And so they told me a lot of stories about the desert. So by age 17, I was going out to the deserts in the western United States and soon after that into Mexico. And I don't want to say it was a genetic predilection, kind of a biophilia impulse to work in deserts, but as soon as I got to the first deserts that I camped and backpacked in, I felt completely at home.
So you often mention your Lebanese heritage. Do you think that had any influence over your interaction with food plants? Did you grow up interacting with a lot of Lebanese cuisine?
I did. In fact, the funny story in our family was when my parents had their wedding, that night my Lebanese grandfather moved in with them on their so-called honeymoon to teach her how to cook Middle Eastern cuisine, something that I'm glad someone didn't pull on me. But I think one of the remarkable discoveries for me after getting a couple biology degrees was that I could relate what I had learned about ecology and economic botany to my own food heritage. Mm-hmm. And one of the big surprises that we can maybe talk about later is that I found that my Arab family could be traced back to spice traders in Yemen and Oman.
Wow. And
so apparently there's some gene in my family that loves collecting and moving around plants.
I guess so. That's really crazy. So when you first started out in this field, you started out more in activism rather than academia. Is that right?
I think that's a good way to say it. And I don't see those two realms as independent. I'm sort of a non-dualistic thinker. But I worked at the first Earth Day headquarters. I dropped out of high school and then after a semester on probation at a small Midwestern liberal arts college, I took a leave of absence, which I don't know how freshmen do that, but I went to work at the First Earth Day headquarters. And as I became concerned about habitat loss and biodiversity loss, after being exposed to all the commentaries that emerged during Earth Day, including from ethnobotanists like Peter Raven and Hugh Iltis, I thought, wow, I wonder how I can get my feet on the ground to do something that would make a difference. And so botany was my first response, because when I played hooky in high school, I went out and identified plants with Donald Colross Speedy's Flora of the Indiana Dunes. So that was the first tangible way I thought I could impact the declining diversity of the world by being involved in restoration and knowing what plants to restore in the dunes where I grew up, and I'm still involved in ecological restoration.
So you and your work have inspired many, many different young scientists. Who inspired you when you were first starting out?
Well, I have to say right off that at this point in my life, moving toward decrepitude, I'm more inspired by the young scientists from your age to even new graduate students who are just doing out-of-the-box thinking about all these issues. So the exciting part of still being active in ethnobotany is being inspired by people younger than you. And yet the folks who first inspired me, many of them were here at Missouri Botanical Garden. The first scientist whose writing was so eloquent that I thought that maybe he was channeling E.B. White or someone like that was Edgar Anderson. And just 2 months ago, I reread Plants, Man, and Life and the landscape papers, and thinking like, wow, how did a scientist take on that beautiful, sort of elegant, very deceptively simple prose style? So then I got to know the whole suite of specialists in different crop genera that were working with or through the garden, like Larry Camplin and Jonathan Sauer on amaranths. Larry worked on beans, and Hugh Cutler and Leonard Blake on cucurbits and many other things. And they inspired me to dig deeper. In the deserts, I had three great mentors. Howard Scott Gentry, who was the USDA plant explorer and one of the founders of economic botany. And I had to flip a coin one summer to work with him or Priscilla Borer, and I worked with Howard, but I still greatly admire and was inspired by Priscilla's work. And then the other mentor that I had just passed away last year, Richard Felger, who's sort of the dean of desert ethnobotany.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell me about one of your favorite plants from arid America, and how did you learn about it? How did you first encounter it?
Well, that's like choosing your favorite child. It's really hard to just focus on one plant, but I've been involved for more than 35 years with both technical and literary writing about wild chilies, because they reach their northernmost range in the county where I now live on the U.S.-Mexican border. And there was this very, very funny incident where I went to a small gift shop in our county called the Santa Cruz Chili and Spice, and they had chiltepines sold there. And I thought, wow, a wild crop relative being sold for the equivalent of about $15 a pound. Now it's like $75 a pound for these wild chilies. I need to learn more about that. So I went back to the herbarium and saw that literally within a mile of the shop was the northernmost population of wild chilies. So I started to hike the canyons there, and a former Border Patrol plant inspector saw me up there and said, "Oh, you're looking for the wild chilies. I'll show you a plant that I found 20 years ago that's still alive. And to this day, I visit that plant almost annually. It's over 50 years old, which is pretty old for a desert subshrub. And, and so one of the craziest things I ever did is that we had Hardy Eshwa out for a symposium about wild chilies. And the night before the chilies, the chili symposium, excuse me, the night before the symposium about wild chili research, I had some friends make wild chili ice cream at a little shop in Tucson. And I went by at 7 o'clock before the symposium to pick up the ice cream, and the shop owner was furious. He said, "You nearly killed my staff last night." And I said, "What happened?" And he said, "Well, they didn't really know how hot they were, and so they put them in boiling water and then put them in a blender, and it vaporized into pepper gas, and they all had to crawl out of the kitchen, the commercial kitchen, and call the ambulance because they had rashes and scars and were having trouble breathing."
Oh my God.
He said, so this 5 gallons set of ice cream has probably cost me $700 in emergency room bills. Thank you for the present.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Well, that's quite a plant then. And tell me a little about the conservation work you've done on the wild chilies.
Well, one of the first in situ conservation reserves for any crop relative in the country. We can debate which was the first because there were wild rice and wild strawberry protected areas in state parks. Was this wild chili reserve above that chili and spice shop on Coronado National Forest lands. And now we're using the term trans situ conservation for our work there because we really want a seamless flow between ex situ studies of chilies that inform us about their morphological and biochemical adaptations to dry climates, and the in situ studies that can help us understand big questions like why chilies are hot, that have to do with their relationships not only to seed dispersers but to fungi and other microbiota that are seed predators during the brief wet time we have in the fall when the fruit are maturing. So we couldn't understand some of the ways that we could use wild chilies in things like integrated pest management until we studied them in situ.
You have, over your career, had a lot of experience with successful boots-on-the-ground conservation projects, it seems. What sort of lessons have you learned about how to pull that off successfully? A lot of scientists, are stuck in this ivory tower of academia, and they're interested in doing this, but it can be really difficult to have successful conservation programs. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, I guess I always misunderstood that metaphor of the ivory tower, and for some reason thought it was the poison ivy tower. So I never wanted to be stuck in a building much. I was blessed to work with some really good applied conservationists and ecological restorationists. And I said, well, why aren't we doing this kind of community-based conservation or restoration with indigenous peoples? Because their lands have been damaged by colonial era oppression and land grabs and environmental disruption. How can we help them restore the places that offered them so many of their medicinal plants and food plants? And so what I realized is that I was inadvertently learning to be patient because any cross-cultural work of any kind teach you by brutal mistakes or by just the delight of working with other people who have different time frames and different priorities, how to be patient and how to listen. And so I think I still continue to work on mangrove and seagrass ecological restoration in Mexico, and in agave and mesquite habitat restoration in Arizona. But it's all community-based, using volunteers, we started a program in our hometown called Earth Care Youth Corps, where 130 some local high school kids are paid to be involved 5 weeks a summer in ecological restoration on farms and ranches with the guidance of old farmers and ranchers, some of whom are their grandparents. And so that kind of restoration, rather than just a contract firm coming in, planning a bunch of things, and leaving, appeals to me because restoration is never done. And when you say you've had successes, you never feel like you've had a success with restoration because you know it has to outlive you to be a success. So I think I've just been blessed to have the tolerance of indigenous communities who wanted that goal and they were willing to put up with a fruitcake ethnobotanist who was interested in collaborating with them on that.
What have you learned specifically from working with these indigenous cultures that you don't think you would have learned otherwise?
Well, patience is one of those things that it's not on my time frame and my goals, it's theirs. And the second gift is that everything is imbued with some kind of story or spiritual lesson, exemplified by the wonderful things in Keith Basso's book about Apache place names, that every one of those place names tells a lesson to people. So part of restoration for them is that you have to restory a place to restore it. You have to know its oral history to know what was there. So we've helped the Zuni community restore a place called Zuni Heaven, where their own youth couldn't help with the restoration work because they hadn't been initiated. So we formed an intertribal, intercultural team to work with Zuni elders to do it. But they drew on what plants to put back into that area, on oral histories that were over 80 to 100 years old because the place had been dewatered, decimated while they were still children, and yet their grandparents told them through stories and songs what plants were there. And so it's a whole different framework about looking at baselines for restoration, the whole idea that we're restoring something back to its virgin condition that was prevalent in ecological restoration or pre-colonial condition is sort of a misguided trope that it denies that Native Americans have been active managers and stewards of vegetation for hundreds and thousands of years. So to really do restoration with that knowledge from within their culture was really revelatory for me.
Mm-hmm. Gary, you are a prolific writer. I'm not sure how you find the time to do all of this writing.
I don't sleep.
But do you have a one piece, either an article or a book that's been your favorite to actually produce, to write, the whole process of it?
Again, it's like your children. You never really say, one's my favorite. And in ways, I have special affection for the first book I wrote, Desert Smells Like Rain. And most people say that was the best thing I ever wrote, and it's gone downhill since then. But they're half kidding me because I think I've added more technical depth to other books, which some people like because it is what they're after, and other people say, I want the stories. So that one is really, in ways, still my favorite too.
Yeah. Do you have one that you think is maybe underappreciated, that you wish more people had read or paid attention to when you first wrote it?
Yes, I published with Island Press a book that they called Why Some Like It Hot, that then was renamed in its second edition Foods, Gene, and Culture. And it's about the coevolutionary interactions between our diet as a selective pressure on our metabolism that affects our genetics, epigenetically or otherwise, and the cultural preparation of foods. So it's a very complex domain that I felt with more and more gene therapies that to some extent have validity, we still had to understand the context under which those genes evolved, especially when they're related to diseases. The irony for me is that book fell off the edge of the table in the United States, but has been a bestseller in Italy and Mexico, and Fondo de Cultura Económica did a beautiful Spanish edition that you can get in almost any bookstore of merit in Mexico, and I've never seen the English edition in a bookstore in the United States. So I think Italians and Mexicans intrinsically get that connection between their own genetic heritage, their diet, and their cultural preparation of foods in a much deeper way than melting pot America.
Yeah, that seems like it would make sense. Let's see. Have you seen a change in how humans relate to food during your career?
Well, some of the elements that now we celebrate widely were first sort of articulated by ethnobotanists who were great writers like Edgar Anderson. So I don't think we can give our generation credit for changing society's love for or appreciation for plants. But I have to say that the slow food movement that included relocalizing food systems and all of that involved dozens and dozens of ethnobotanists in helping chefs and food system activists decide what foods that were distinctive to their region or locality needed revival, and that in many cases the knowledge of ethnobotanists guided the community into bringing these back into the marketplace in our area, largely with Native American and Hispanic producers. So in Tucson alone, that's now one of 30-some UNESCO cities of gastronomy. Since we got that designation that Jonathan Mabry, a food archaeologist, and I worked on together to submit to UNESCO, more than 140 native food products, both ancient domesticates and wild forage foods, are back in the marketplace, and 40 different micro-enterprises have started up since we got the designation that are putting those in farmers markets and in restaurants and all of that. And so the multiplier effect of those foods stays in the community and sort of resonates or ripples out from those producers, and that wealth is kept in the community. So it's good community economics as well as a really interesting conservation strategy. We say you got to eat it to save it, which is the exact opposite of how conservationists used to think about things. You have to leave it alone. You have to lock it up. Mm-hmm. And our notion was what we call eco-gastronomic restoration, that you could only keep the food in the marketplace if farmers or foragers were given the value of their efforts, and then they would make sure that they were better stewards of the plant because they were making their living off it.
Sure. What are some of the examples of these foods in your area?
Well, some of the most interesting ones for me were our mesquite. That the first publications about the value of mesquite that came out from Arizona researchers were in the 1890s, and it just kind of sat there. Mesquite was considered not an exotic species, but an invasive species into grasslands. that was not, the mesquite was an invader, it was that those were poorly grazed, and as grass cover declined, mesquite had open niches to colonize. So Richard Felger and I wrote about mesquite's value in the 1970s, and again, nothing happened. And then in the 90s, with the slow food movement, this thing started to emerge that communities were willing to invest in hammer mills. It cost about $4,000 to $6,000 to have community millings of mesquite. Saturday, with a mill that lives in our garage, among the other mills that were brought to a Tucson event, more than 250 people brought their mesquite pods from their yard and from the washes near their house to mill and take back for making pancakes, breads, crackers, whatever. And it's a major food in health clinics to help people with adult onset diabetes manage their blood sugar levels. So one micro enterprise sells directly to health clinics who then distribute the mesquite tortillas to their clients. So that's really satisfying, because these aren't just elite boutique foods for high-end restaurants. These are really helping the people most in need of positive change after 50 years of communities being overwhelmed by fast foods.
Mm-hmm. How has your lifelong work changed how you eat? Mm-hmm. Has it changed it? And how has it changed how you relate to other people and how they eat as well?
Well, I don't want to get teary-eyed, but it makes me so grateful to the people who bring us our daily bread, who are the lowest paid people in the United States. Farm workers and food service workers have the most difficulty keeping their own families fed. They're the people most likely to have to go to food banks. They suffer from the exposure of agrochemicals to a degree 100 times greater than those of us who eat conventionally grown foods. And they're most likely to suffer in the days of climate change from heat stroke, heat exhaustion, dehydration, and end up in urgent care or emergency rooms. So it's not so much that trying to relocalize my diet and connect directly with the producers, ranchers, farmers, and foragers, fishers that produce my food, that it's about me having a perfect diet that can be put in health magazines. It makes me humbled by the fact that our society hasn't figured out a way to sustain our essential workers in our food system. And it's changed the direction of my research and my volunteer work to try to help them in any way I can.
For people who aren't directly involved in scientific research and conservation in their careers, do you have some advice on what they can do if they're still interested in helping cultural and ecological diversity thrive?
Well, thank you for that question. In a little book called Ethnobiology for the Future that University of Arizona Press put out 5 or 6 years ago, there was a letter to a young ethnobotanist that I put in it as an introduction, thanking them for wanting to be engaged in this and suggesting that however technical their own studies get, whether it's radioisotope studies or nutrition lab studies or field ecology, it's really important that they practice, as many wonderful ethnobotanists that we grew up with practice, like Gail Wagner, that you have a direct relationship to plants, either as fiber or food or medicine or basketry, that you yourself practice, so that when you talk to other people, it's sort of practitioner to practitioner. And it sort of takes a lot of the silliness out of our questions to other practitioners, but it shows that we're not just voyeurs or bystanders, that we feel it's worth investing in our own lives. However technical our research may be, we need that, but that we also have hands-on experience with what we're studying. Mm-hmm. It's not one or the other.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of the things that you're most excited about with your current research projects, your new directions?
Well, we briefly talked about this paper on arid land crops, many of which are wild relatives, that in ways was inspired by what Allison Miller here, well, many of your staff were involved with Allison in some of the database work, but she was looking at herbaceous perennials, largely in the legume family, and we thought, wow, we really need to do that for the desert regions of North America, do that kind of inventory, because within 30 to 50 years, well over 40% of the land surface of North America is going to be hitting hot, dry conditions. And we know we're facing water shortages. We know that Seattle this last week hit 110 degrees, and that water scarcity is in 12 states. We're in a 22-year-long drought with soil moisture levels the lowest that they've been in 120 years in baseline measurements. So how do we mobilize the great botanists and plant scientists at large to take on redesigning our agriculture for a hotter and drier world? And I think the model for that is a very interesting one. During World War II, there was an emergency rubber project to get an alternative source of rubber, primarily looking at Waiuli, a desert-adapted plant of the Chihuahuan Desert. And over 1,000 American scientists, from graduate level on to people who'd already won Nobel Prizes, were involved in that collaborative effort. That's what we need to really evaluate and adapt the 100-some genera of highly adapted arid plant foods to a redesigned agriculture for dry lands and hotter climates. About 80% of our conventional crops really can't flower and produce fruit when the temperature in their canopies is above 95 degrees. We're hitting 115, 120 degrees in Arizona regularly, and that's not the only place that's happening. So we need something like these green job corps of people taking this on, like the scientists and volunteers mobilized in the Federal Workers Project during the Dust Bowl, and with this emergency rubber project during World War II. 4 Nobel Prize winners in physiology and plant chemistry emerged out of that set of 1,000 scientists, and that's only one indicator of how much impact they had on science and on our economy in the following years. We need that kind of collaborative effort again to deal with the challenges of a hotter, drier world.
Mm-hmm. Are there any lessons that you think desert and arid plants and ecosystems can teach us about sustainability in particular?
I always say that agave is another one of my favorite plants. Teach us more than we could find out at an AA meeting about responsible drinking. I mean, for the same amount of edible biomass, they're using 2 to 6 times less water than most conventional crops. But it reminds us that we can't genetically engineer that into corn or wheat. It's that their leaves are water harvesting mechanisms that bring all the water that drops on it down to the roots. They're opening their stomata at night to do part of their photosynthetic work then when water loss is lowest. And there's a dozen other adaptations, even the silvery, gray, glossy color reflects off radiation so that the heat load on the plant is less. So we need to think about the concept of biomimicry for all our future designing or redesigning of crops. How can we learn from the most desert adapted plants and how they survive under dry and hot and saline conditions, and whether we do that technologically or genetically, move our agricultural systems in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like some of those lessons could apply even outside of crops, even
That's
with
right.
homes or...
That's right, and the Biomimicry Institute actually teaches engineers and designers first some lessons from plants to give them good metaphors for looking at applications in other fields. You're exactly right.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is kind of one of the most surprising or unexpected developments that has happened during your career? What's something you didn't anticipate seeing?
Well, I had a conversation about this with a great integrative health proponent, Dr. Andrew Weil, who is one of Richard Schulte's ethnobotany students at Harvard. And we both said the same thing. None of us anticipated how much our health and the health of our soil is due to the microbiota, and that now probiotics, there's more than 40 beverages traditionally made in Mexico that are probiotic beverages that also help reduce blood sugar levels in diabetics. So in many ways, we're suffering from what Velasquez Manoff calls an epidemic of absence, that antibiotics have knocked out so many beneficial microbiota, not only in our guts, but in our agricultural soils, that we're suffering epidemics because of the lack of diversity, microbial diversity in our diets and in our agricultural environments. And Andrew Weil said, I could have never anticipated how important that is to our immune systems and the health of agroecosystems.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. In your field of ethnobotany and conservation, is there one thing that you wish you could just snap your fingers and change instantaneously? One of these struggles that you've just dealt with for a long time.
I'll tell you a strange one that has relevance to what all we do. And that's that when I was pretty young, I was put on a committee to write a code of ethics for plant collectors for the UN Food and Agricultural Organization. And we each had 4 months to gather data from different kinds of professionals through surveys and interviews. And I concentrated on indigenous peoples who were really talking about food sovereignty, that they wanted more control over how seeds or other plant materials were collected from their homelands, and we all understand that now. But when I brought that back to this committee, the lawyers on the committee said, oh, that's really interesting, but we're under the mandates of the UN and its Food and Agriculture Organization, and those rights have been, in our mind, are held at the national level, not with tribes. And I said, what? Many of those tribes are in struggle against their national governments, their federal governments. How can you cede all the rights to something that may be intertribal, it may not be the rights of one tribe, to a federal government who in many cases has colonized, suppressed, and actually performed genocide against them? And if I could do one magic wand, it would be to remedy that, like UNEP in ways has done. The UN environmental program has given indigenous peoples rights at the same level as federal governments. But I think it's essential that we have to have benefit sharing with those groups, but we also have to understand how they think about them aside from technical economic measurements for benefit sharing. For instance, we just worked with tribes on landmark legislation to give saguaro cacti personhood, sacred personhood, and put all federal, state agencies and contractors who come into their Aboriginal territory, not just a reservation, that they consider saguaro cacti humankind, with feelings, with interactions with humans, that they were, in their creation narrative, they're derived from humans and are sentient beings, and that now has legal basis in the United States and in many other countries. And I think we'll see it as the first of many legislative actions by First Nations peoples to regain their sovereignty and stewardship over those resources.
Your work has definitely influenced many young researchers, not only in what they research, but also in how they do research. What directions are you hoping that this younger generation will take in the future and move with these foundations that you've laid?
Well, they're so creative and drawing eclectically on so many different disciplines and skill sets that the enjoyment I have at this point in my life is seeing them being able to test hypotheses that I could never do over most of my career, and that's just a joy. But I think that one thing that we have to get over is seeing science, particularly evolutionary biology, in some way in conflict with spirit-based approaches to the natural world. Most indigenous people don't use the metaphors that we use for evolutionary processes, but they understand the dynamism and concepts like symbiosis and mutualisms and facilitation in their own terms. And so I think the distance between respecting the spiritual traditions of indigenous people and other traditional communities is paramount to building larger coalitions with scientists for the conservation and restoration of the remaining living riches of this precious world we live in. Scientists do not have enough status in society at large to change the direction of our economy and our consumptive patterns alone. And we need to make peace with and collaborations with people of different spirit-based or faith-based traditions to accomplish what they want and what we want. We can't have that divide between science and faith anymore if we really want this planet and its cultural and biodiversity to survive. And for me, biological and cultural diversity are a seamless continuum.
Mm-hmm. If you're comfortable talking about it, I'm interested in how your own faith interacts with your work at all.
Well, some of my first memories as a really young child before age 5 was conversing with birds and plants. And then, you're kind of told that that's silly after a point. And then later on in life, you realize that a lot of people not only believe that, but practice it. And along the way, when I've had personal setbacks because of my own mistakes and my own suffering, I realized that science enough wasn't sufficient to lead me into a happier, enriched life. And so I become an ecumenical Franciscan brother. I just came back from a 4-day retreat with my brothers and sisters. I regularly work in interfaith and intertribal coalition trying to protect sacred places, many of which incidentally are biodiverse places. And so that's my personal predilection or inclination. I don't expect everyone else to take up that banner, but for me, in my remaining days on Earth before I too become compost to help plants grow, that's what I really want to work on, making sure that there's dialogue between faith-based communities and the incredible richness of science itself. And frankly, both of those realms should make us more humble as humans. That the great thing about science is that things we wrote about or hypothesized about younger can be proved wrong, and we can celebrate that rather defending our territory. And faith is also supposed to be a humbling rather than an arrogant practice. And so I think the world needs to be a lot humbler, the human race does, to make room for other species. And faith practice helps me stay humble, because there's a lot of reminders around us that when we get arrogant, we screw up.
So, do you have any things that you would change if you could go back to the beginning of your career? Is there anything you would do differently?
Just about everything. I wish I had deeper training in biosystematics and linguistics, because linguistics is so key to my current work. And that I think there's been a certain level of naivety in classical ethnobotany about issues such as native sovereignty. And so I think the biggest change I would recommend, if I could do it again, and for all of us, is that we actually take seriously that when we're given a PhD, we're a doctor of philosophy and science. And very few of us ever have a bioethics course, a history of science, or a philosophy course. And I think we need all those. How can we make the decisions, moral decisions about genetic engineering or the use of pesticides on 3.5 million acres of agricultural lands around the world, billion acres, if I said million, without having underpinnings of ethics, bioethics in particular. I think all of us need to be better versed, or at some point academia should decide that they shouldn't give us a degree that is called a doctor in philosophy of, because most of us are undertrained in that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I want to end off with kind of a fun question. So you have done a lot of traveling throughout your career. Is there a story that sticks out in your mind as one of your favorite trips, or one of your maybe one of the experiences that had a really big impact on you?
Well, I worked on a book on spice trade for University of California Press that sort of overlapped with going to 6 of the Vavilov centers of crop diversity or crop origins, depending on how you see them. I think of them as crop origins because a wild crop relative diversity may be somewhere else. But on the way to travel every major historical spice trail in the world, I ended up in Oman because I couldn't get into Yemen. And I was hosted by a great crew of Omani scientists that have been trained in Russia and Europe and the United States that were fantastic hosts. And I'd said I'd really like to see some of the oldest spice markets here. The first one that we took me to, they said, we have a little surprise for you. And they took me to the Nabhan spice market where there was a distant cousin who is still selling frankincense and myrrh and many of the culinary spices from the Arabian Peninsula. So I realized I'm not just studying this is part of my own family heritage.
Wow.
And then the guy said, well, I want to take you to another place. And I said, now come on, what is it this time? And he said, it's just a World Heritage Site. I think every tourist visiting Oman should visit that. And it was the Bahla Fort in the interior of Oman, not on the coast. And he said, this was part of the Nabhanid dynasty that ruled Oman for 4 centuries, and they were spice traders, and this is where they hid the spices from pirates. And I'm thinking, this is in my own family history? And then he took me up to a peninsula, not a peninsula, highland mesa or butte above the fort. And one of my earliest memories was being hugged by my uncles and my father. And I thought that all Lebanese men smelled like rose water. I didn't know that they were splashing it on them after shaving. I just thought they smelled that way. And we went up to this mesa where a number of great ethnobotanists have worked, including my friend Ike Ludeling. And there on this mesa, every woman is growing roses to make rose water. Oh, wow. And they said, this is your family heritage. And by the way, there's also a fruit tree here named for your family. So here I'd been gathering heirloom fruit trees all over Mexico and the United States for years, and I didn't even know that there was one name for my own family.
Wow.
So some of these strains and interests run deep in our families, and it just seemed like an incredible blessing to go back to the origins of that and celebrate that.
So can you, I study fruit trees. I'm very interested in fruit trees. So can you tell me a little about this fruit tree that was named after your family, and then also about the ones that you've been collecting and growing yourself?
Yeah, so that was a date, a date palm.
Mm-hmm.
And when we went to see it in the marketplace at Bahla Fort, he said, the salesman is an elderly man who's your relative, and he can tell you the story. And we got there on about 110-degree day, and all I saw was a guy sleeping on his on his piles of dates. So I never got that story. But I, in my own orchard garden in Patagonia, Arizona, I have 140 different varieties of arid adapted fruits. 40 different varieties of pomegranates, figs, quinces, pistachios, jujubes. I could keep on naming them. But I'm doing something that is part of a Arab and Morisco or Andalusian tradition of having a private plant experiment station that Arabs call an almunia, where, like Thomas Jefferson, you bring plants in to evaluate, and then you freely share them with your neighbors. And so I'm evaluating what arid adapted plants work at 4,000 feet, where we still have pretty serious freezes in the wintertime, which is different than what we can even grow 50 miles away at another elevation. And so that daily work with fruit trees is sort of what grounds me and keeps my head from being in the clouds all the time.
Nice. Well, Gary, I want to say thank you so much for being here and talking with me. I've learned a lot, and it's just been a real honor to have this opportunity. And at this time, I'm going to introduce Robbie Hart, who is the director of the William L. Brown Center, to present you with the William L. Brown Medal for this year in 2021.
Well, thank you, and it's an honor to be back at the garden again. This place has meant so much to me and to my wife over the years that it feels like a home away from home, and your staff is so brilliant and compassionate that I don't know what my life would be without my periodic visits here like Mecca.
Well, we look forward to having you back whenever you're in town.
Thank you.
So Gary, that was such a pleasure to listen to. You're as inspiring in conversation as you are in your scholarly work and your books. And it's my absolute honor to, on behalf of the William L. Brown Center and the Missouri Botanic Garden, present you with the 9th William L. Brown Award.
Well, again, I have such great respect for William Brown, Alice Brown, and the entire family legacy there that this is a deep honor, because getting an award in the name of people who are your heroes is doubly meaningful. So thank you, and thank everyone in the garden for considering me.
Wonderful.